Recording in progress.
and hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Hannah, for that great introduction, and thanks for the invitation to present to you all today. In the spirit of this being a workshop, I want to encourage everyone, please do put questions and comments in the chat throughout the presentation. Hannah tells me that she's going to help monitor those and make sure that I see all of them. So I really do want to see your questions and feedback, and happy to address them as we go and at the end, depending on the best time to do that. So I'm going to share some slides here with you all, talk through a few things from the perspective of what we're doing, show some examples, and eager to hear what you all think as we go along. So again, please do take a moment to put a question in the chat as you see fit. By way of introduction, Hannah did a great job, so I don't have too much more to say. But yes, I did work in the public sector myself before joining Microsoft about 2.5 years ago now. Did work for the state of New York, including during the pandemic, and got to see firsthand sort of the challenges the public sector has faced, both in dealing with that emergency situation and the challenges that are coming out of the current situation as we emerge from the emergency. I will add, I have been working in government operations as well, although I am now focusing on public transportation. So a lot of what you'll see here is not just transportation focused by any means. It does cover a lot of general use cases that will apply across different kinds of government agencies and organizations. And that is the intended scope of what I'm talking about here today. I shared this quote from a short blog post I wrote for Microsoft late last year, just on how I approach digital transformation, which is really about starting small, focusing on use cases that matter to you, and driving hard on your execution on those specific things with the intention that they can be built out later into a bigger platform that can transcend a single use case, right? It's really important in government. There is as much policy and process and stakeholder consensus, as I say here, to all of these kinds of digital transformation efforts as there are technology, and is very cognizant of that, especially in this public sector space. When we talk about technology, that we're really talking about change management and people management and training and skilling and all of these things that surround just the technology that we'll be talking about today. So a little bit about me and my perspective. I'm going to just give you a brief overview of sort of how I think about artificial intelligence as an all-up perspective, what I'm seeing globally from your peers in government and the public sector. And then I'm going to show a couple of demos of particularly generative AI in action so that you all can see how folks are starting to use that, how I myself would have liked to use it as well when I was working in the public sector, for that matter, and then dive deep on a couple of those stories to show some of the impact I'm seeing globally as this kind of technology is put into practice. So that's what we'll be going through here today, and looking forward to diving in. So I'll start with a brief history lesson, actually, just by way of explaining a broader perspective on AI. A lot of the conversation over the last 12 to 18 months has focused on generative AI, which is really a specific use of AI that can be very creative in terms of how it is putting together content, whether that's written or visual. It's very good at doing things like content summaries and so forth. But really, there's a much longer history here, including things like machine learning, including lots of technologies that you may already be using in your governments. And when we talk about AI, I like to think about all of those technologies together, not just on generative AI, because it helps, I think, especially when we're talking about the way that governments adopt the technology and how they're explaining it to constituents and being transparent about their use of technology and data, to put it in the context of other things that have been done over the last decades. When it comes to the collection of information and data, when it comes to how that's being used and analyzed, how people are kept in the loop during decision-making processes. These are all things that governments have been working on and thinking about putting together policies on for a long time. And generative AI is definitely a powerful new way of using data, but it is also building on those steps that came before. So I am part of Microsoft's worldwide government team, as Hannah said earlier, and there's really four major pillars, if you will, that we think about in terms of how technology is supporting government, and that includes AI. So I wanted to give you just this one slide of context in terms of how at Microsoft we're thinking about this. One, and I'll just go left to right here, delivering innovation and programs experiences. This is all about how residents, citizens are experiencing how their governments are using technology, whether that's making it easier to apply for services, whether it's making it easier to pay for something like transit, whatever those use cases may be that are very public facing. And but it's also about the workforce, all of that work that's being done behind the scenes that a lot of times the public may never see, but is instrumental into the operations of government. So thinking about ways that we're empowering that workforce with technology in a way that aligns with their mission, especially. Transforming operations and services. Again, this is going to be thinking about all of those applications and that are, again, some public facing, some perhaps just visible to the back office staff that are instrumental to the operation of your agency or organization, making sure that those things are resilient and sustainable, able to withstand shocks to the system. I think I mentioned the pandemic earlier, but obviously one thing that a lot of governments dealt with, including in New York State where I was at the time, was the massive influx in need for services, and the ability to scale up and down as demand changes is one of the examples of how technology can support that transformation of operations and services. And then security, I just need to spend a little time on because it's tremendously important, both from a practical operational standpoint and making sure that those services and websites and everything that's surrounding it stays up and operational from a cybersecurity standpoint, but also because it's tremendously important for trust. And trust is a topic I'll get into a little bit more later, but when it comes to public sector, how you handle data, making sure that there's confidence when it comes to the residents and the citizens to how they are feeling about how the government is using their data is tremendously important. And that's a security question as well as a policy question, of course. So what am I seeing when it comes to generative AI in government right now? Quite a lot of things, actually. Content creation and design is one of those things that, if we think about content creation in the context of government, a press release is a great example, and I'll show an example of that later. This is one of the places people are starting to pick up the use of generative AI first, because it is one that folks maybe have already been able to play around with, one of the publicly available tools, start to understand how this is working, and getting to that first draft a lot quicker. But we're also seeing things like using AI for accelerating automation, using the ability to start filling forms automatically, chatbots and virtual assistants when it comes to those public-facing 311 type services where people are able to ask and get information from publicly available information that's already out there. Makes it a lot easier in a lot of cases. So chatbots are one that have obviously come up before in the context of governments, and I think folks have seen some successes, and let's be honest, some failures in terms of chatbot deployments over the last 15 years or so. But generative AI is really a pretty significant shift in the way that those chatbots and virtual assistants can actually serve people and get them the information they need. And we're starting to see some of those deployed now, both in the US and globally. Things like translation, and we'll see an example of a customer of ours that has done this to make sure that their content is accessible, particularly important for places that serve populations that use many different languages. Starting to do things like fraud detection, where we want to make sure that the services are not being taken advantage of, and of course, doing so in a way that isn't going to disenfranchise someone who does deserve that service. It's just equally, if not more important. Predictive analytics and forecasting, creative writing, content generation, and then we're starting to see these use cases in the medical side as well, which is really fascinating for supporting health agencies as well. I mentioned that trust is really important when it comes to the topic of generative AI. And this is sort of the perspective that I bring and that Microsoft brings to the discussion that I think is a good starting place when it comes to a set of principles around the data, because it's really just about the data. Your data is your data. That's the basic principle here. We've heard, I'm sure you've heard quite a bit about different AI models, how those things are trained, and the baseline, I think, standard that should be in place is that data is not used to additionally train the model, and that's what we're talking about here. This is not something that's being pulled into the larger system. There's not going to be another government that is able to access the data because that data was put into a prompt field, something like that. And when it comes to this bottom point about data being protected in the cybersecurity discussion that I mentioned a few minutes ago, the same controls that apply to the data in every other context should apply in the context of AI as well. So if I'm an employee and I have a certain set of access to data, the use of AI will not and should not change that level of access in any way. Those permissions that I have should be inherited, and the access that I have should be inherited in the context of AI. When you put all that together, it's really about what I mentioned earlier, building that trust both within the government and within the constituency that data is being used in a responsible way. So when we look at what that looks like in practice, there's a set of principles and standards here that I think are particularly important to bringing all of that together in practice. Thinking about what the principles are in your government that you want to ensure are reflected in the use of AI: fairness, privacy, security, transparency, inclusiveness, and so forth. Having a standard, and this is from Microsoft's perspective on the requirements and practices of the use of AI, and only using AI when it is the appropriate tool for the job. Thinking about the training and the tools and the testing that need to go into any given implementation, putting thought into how that is actually happening within your organizational structure and within our organizational structure to make sure that they're being used correctly. And then on the back end of that, oversight. So as things are rolled out and put into practice and tested, that there's monitoring, reporting, and auditing in place to ensure that all of those things that we think should be happening are actually happening in practice. And if they're not, that feedback is being received quickly so that folks can take action. Safety is just the other side of the coin from trust, and these principles all together, I think, address some of that. So with all of that context set, there's a lot of folks really using this technology today. And so I've got a few examples here that I've pulled out that I think are particularly interesting. So the city of Kelowna is a city in Canada that is using chatbots to really change the way that they are addressing citizen needs, particularly when it comes to navigating complex processes that folks have to deal with in government. A good example of that is permitting, which is complicated, which requires a lot of information. And they're using a chatbot to help funnel people into the right place, and starting to do a little bit of like say first level analysis of those forms as they get filled out, so that things that maybe in the past have been required a lot of back and forth between the applicant and the person who's reviewing that application can be sidestepped by using an artificial intelligence to say, actually, you know what, the thing that you've put into this field isn't going to be accepted no matter what. And so a lot of those low-hanging fruit issues, it's not doing the eligibility analysis itself entirely right. It's still going through a person, but it's getting some of those out of the way in a way that will free up those assessors and those reviewers to really focus on the ones that have some kind of difficult review process, and not somebody put the wrong thing into the field and now that's going to cause 3 weeks of back and forth to make sure we get it right. India, Bhuvan is doing a language translation solution using generative AI that is supporting over 3 million people a day in terms of making sure that available information from the government is in those languages. And I'll talk a little bit more about this one later. In Ville de Laval in Quebec, we're seeing a 311 service starting to use more generative AI to automate the responses to lots and lots of these calls every day. Similar to what we're seeing in Kelowna in terms of a digital interface, but bringing that into the call center interface to help automate those questions, which really can be answered in a straightforward way to give the call center workers the time to really focus on the ones that need their attention the most. And then the Attorney General's office in Brazil working on using generative AI to review lawsuits, support employees, and optimize their time. So this is when anytime when there is a lot of content that needs to be analyzed and looked at, gotten summaries of, this is a way to help get through the first layer of that process much more quickly and efficiently. And we're seeing that in this case in Brazil. But I want to also give you all a look at what this looks like in practice and how you can think about using it yourselves. So I'm going to, for the moment, stop sharing this slide. I'm going to share a new screen here. All right, you should all be able to see that. This is a demonstration of generative AI technology that we've put together. You'll see it says City Portal in the upper left. Put this together with the idea of thinking about the different ways folks may interact with a city, or potentially the employees of a city may use it. But most of this is going to be just as applicable in the context of a county government or a state government as it would in the context of a city government. This is what we call an information assistant, and it's a great use of generative AI. What we've done here is uploaded a series of documents to a backend. It just means we've got some PDFs, things like that, that are containing unstructured information. And in this kind of use case allows us to think about what are some different ways we can get summaries out of this body of knowledge more efficiently than having to read through all of these documents. Is going to take a lot of time. In this case, we focused a lot on sustainability, and there's a few questions we have preloaded in here for the sake of the demo. So let's talk about why is public sentiment trending down? So it's going to take a moment. It's going to look through the back end of the files that we've uploaded to the system. And after a moment, it'll come back with us to it for an answer. And there it is. So this is generated in real time using generative AI. It says public sentiment is trending down due to deteriorating air quality, and it gives a short summarization of why this might be taking place. And the interesting thing that generative AI can be built to do, and this is, I think, when you think about using generative AI as public servants, something that you want to think about is these citations. When we talk about explainability and transparency, understanding where information is coming from, this is one of the conversations that comes up the most when I have conversations about AI with public servants. And there's a lot of interest around making sure that that is reliable. So generative AI can be built in ways that help folks understand where the information is coming from. So I've clicked on the citation here. You can see on the right, it's popped up a little viewer of the document where it came up, and allows me to review it quite quickly by seeing the page where this information was coming from. And there's also a couple of other tabs up here that I'll just mention real briefly to give you a sense of what's there. So one, it will tell me sort of where these documents are and what the information is. And two, it has this is a bit more of a technical side of it, but relevant, I think, in the case of this discussion, is it will give me more information about what the exact prompt that was generated was. And a lot of times these prompts are what's giving the system the information about how it should answer. And the generative AI tools are typically built with some generalized prompt that is added to when you type into the box. And then it starts to give you more information about the sources of the information and what it found. And so put these three things together, and there's an ability to verify the information is correct quickly, as well as give the technical staff more information about how, from a technical standpoint, the answer was generated. And this can be used with any sorts of, general sorts of documents that you might have. PDFs are a common one because there's long sorts of, or Word documents where there's long sets of unstructured information. And a lot of folks have to deal with managing that, reading a new study, putting together some information about a new policy that's being worked on and so forth. And this sort of tool can help get at that. There's one other example I want to show you all that is perhaps a little bit more fun and shows off a little bit more about how generative AI can be used. And in this case, we've put together a prompt that you can see down here in the bottom left for a city who wants to advertise on social media about this new fleet of electric buses it has. Now, this could be really in any kind of public communications setting. This is the example we've chosen to do, and we've given it a set of instructions about what we want it to do. We want it to be an Instagram post. We want it to have a picture of the bus, and we want it to have a captivating headline. We want to use words that convey sustainability and efficiency. And I'll just call out this little one at the bottom that we ask it to create a little poem as well. So let's see what it comes up with. We'll hit process. This is doing it in real time. It comes up with slightly different every time I do the demo. So let's see. So it's created a couple of image options for us. The aspect ratio is a little strange, but is, on full size will look normal. And then here's what it's come up with. So it's generated this text based on our prompt, sort of supporting those public service announcements or other public communications things. And it may not be perfect. Your comms teams would probably want to take a stab at making some edits or inserting some key messaging that you've all agreed on. But it gets to that first draft really quickly. Also could be useful in a context where getting information out to the public in real time in sort of a more serious situation, an emergency, something like that is really important. And getting into those drafts with the information is really quick in this kind of use of the tool. So when we think about how to do this, giving the instructions clearly is tremendously important, thinking about what you want it to do. And then you can take that and edit it from there. And we have the opportunity to, again, look at the process that was used, look at the prompt that was used for the bus itself, and start to maybe make an edit to that and redo it if we'd like. So that's just another example of how these kinds of tools are quite flexible in the way they're actually used and can be used. And when it comes to the content that's generated, you always have the option to reread it, make sure it has the information you want before sending it out into the world. I'm going to switch back. As I'm switching back, Hannah, are there any pressing questions that we want to answer before we move on? I have a couple of more videos that I'll show and talk over related to the use case, but I want to stop if there are any questions.
Frank is just asking if you could clarify what is the surprise factor?
Oh yeah, so there is a surprise factor here. There's so we've built out this particular version of the generative AI to have a slider here in the left that we can sort of make it more creative or less creative in terms of how it's going to come up with the answer and what it produces. So if you want something that is going to be a little bit less creative and really stick very, very closely to the prompt, you want to minimize that. And if you want it to maybe surprise you a little bit and come up with something that's a little more creative, you can put that slider over to the max. This is something that you could also set on the back end, right? So maybe you don't want your comms staff to have control over that variable, and you just always want it to stick very closely to the prompt that they create. Then you don't need to build out the slider. You could just say, in the way you're building the tool, we're going to keep this at a minimum all the time, for example. That's all that it's doing there.
Thanks. I'll keep the other questions till the end. That's the only question.
Okay. Now let me head us back to the slides. There we go. Good. So when we think about what we actually do to enable all of this, right? Though there's the tools that are going to be presented to the employees that folks are going to need to be trained on. I talked a little bit about prompts in that last section, and that's one of the areas on which as employees are onboarded into using an AI tool, particularly a generative AI tool, that it's worth spending time on in your organization, thinking about how those prompts are developed and how people are engaging with the tools to get the answers that they really want out of it. But it's a lot of that is what's generating those things like employee and productivity, thinking about how it's helping your organization innovate, and then finally, as I mentioned earlier, thinking about what are the ways that are going to safeguard this so that your business as an agency is not disrupted, and is in fact, the mission that you're trying to do is amplified. So when we think about how we're doing these tools from a Microsoft perspective, and I realize that's just one of many when it comes to AI, we're thinking about how to build these tools and support our customers in building these tools when they're customized in a way that's going to do each of those things as well as possible. So I'm going to spend just a moment on Copilot, which is a tool that accompanies the Microsoft Office tools that you're probably pretty familiar with. And I wanted to take a moment on this because for me, as a former public servant, this is something that would have been tremendously helpful and is one that now I'm using all the time myself. This is a tool that's for perfect visibility for you all, not available today in GCC. So if you're in a government cloud for Microsoft, this is a tool that's not available today, but will be later this year. And it has a tremendous impact on the way that those tools can be used. And just to share a little bit of the actual impact we're seeing from our work trend index, and I can share some of the links from our work lab that's really diving into how these tools are having an impact on work, but dramatically saving time on searching for information and doing knowledge management types of tasks, automating things that are considered mundane tasks like inputting the same information into multiple places. Catching up on meetings is one that I use literally every day. I know my schedule is very packed, and I'm sure yours is too. And then when we looked at some of these tools, like average, you're saving about an hour a week, which over the course of any amount of time really adds up into a lot of time saved, and allowing folks to focus on those tasks that are most important to their domain knowledge. So if someone's really an expert on human services and developing or delivering a particular service and that whole process that you have on your back end, we want you to be able to spend the most time really applying that expertise and less time on those tasks that are a little less domain specific. So what does it look like in practice? You'll see that's pretty similar to the interface that you just saw, but applied to some of those back office type of tools. So this is a demo that one of my colleagues, Anna, put together that shows a Word document. And as you can see here, it's about 4 or 5 pages long. In the context of this demo, it's a marketing plan, but it could be anything. And that Copilot tool is that generative AI tool that's going to look at the content of that document and start to allow you to have a conversation in plain language with the document, if you will. So the first example that you see here that's happening on the right is she's just asked for a summary and gotten a 4 bullet point summary of what all the content is in this document. Tool will also help you give you some recommendations about what you might want to ask based on what it's finding. But in this particular case, you're not limited to those, right? So as you can see here, the next question is, does this document mention anything related to geography? And that will take a moment to come up here on the screen as the video goes. It'll take a look at all that content, start to analyze it, and this is about as much time as you would expect it to take in real life. We haven't cut down, changed, etc., the amount of time it would take to generate that answer. And then it gives you this answer in that same window, and it says, according to the document, it does. It states that the services can be offered globally, and so forth. So it's able to take that context and start to understand a little bit more about it. It can also do generation, and the same way that we did some posts for social media in the example I walked through a couple of minutes ago, in this context, we're gonna talk about drafting a longer document like a press release. And so as the prompt comes in here, we start to think about what the content that we want to include in this is going to be. It's going to reference actually the document we were just looking at as a way of us starting with that content. And then it's going to take a moment, look through it, analyze it, and start to generate that content directly into a Word document. So anytime you're working with that the written word in a a policy context, a press release context, anytime you need to put together a report or things like that, this is the sort of tool that you want to think about. How am I using this tool from a prompt standpoint? What am I asking the generative AI to do? And then what am I getting back out of it? So you'll see it's starting to generate the content. And as it finishes doing that, one thing I do want to mention that's come up in several conversations I've had recently is transparency and making sure that when a document is edited and put forward to the public that may have been influenced by AI, maybe it was generated in part like this, that it is evident to people that AI was used as a tool in the creation of that. That's a policy question, one I think that state and local governments should think about, whether it be in the context of a press release or a social media post or even in an email that they may be using generative AI to help them write. And it is one of those questions. So it's generated our context here now. Our content here, and I look at it as a first draft, right? Getting to that first draft in any document can be a pretty time-consuming process. This did it for us in about 45 seconds, 30 seconds, and it's a great starting place. And then I can go in just like I can edit any other document and start making some changes if I'd like to, make sure the content aligns with what I'm expecting it to do, and so forth. So an example of how these tools are used in the back end for people who do a lot of work within these sorts of office tools. The other example I want to show is related to, in this case, Teams, and thinking about how this can help folks get caught up on meetings. I mentioned this one earlier, and this is what it looks like in practice. So what we see here is a recap of a meeting. This is some functionality that's already built into Teams, and thinking about the ways that AI can amplify the usefulness of the information that's been generated, whether it's from a transcript, from meeting notes, from things that people were speaking during the meeting. For me, whenever I have a conflict of a meeting and I'm not able to join it, I do use this tool in practice, and it would have made my life a lot easier when I was in public service as well. So as you can see, we're asking what decisions were made. So it's good with these kinds of questions that even aren't specific. It can figure out based on the context what you're asking. And in this case, we get a list of decisions that were made, some of them related to the project in question, but also some related to who was assigned a particular action. In this case, they said they delayed the launch of their project by a month. Now we're getting some qualitative information, right? Was it an easy decision? Was anyone upset? So this is something, if you're reviewing a meeting, you don't want just the information, but you're also going to want that contextual information that you might have gained, obviously, from social cues if you were there, but may not come across as much. And I'll rewind it just a bit so that we can get to the right point in the video here. See if I can do this. Might have to let it play. So in the context there, it was saying that it wasn't an easy decision. People did express that they were not necessarily all happy with the result, and we'll see that as it comes up here. But they were not feeling upset or hostile as a result of the decision that was made. And so it's able to take a look at the language that was used and give you an idea of that sort of qualitative analysis as well. And for me, this is the sort of thing that I want when I'm going to be catching up on a meeting. Some of those just hard, what was decided, what happened, and then two, a little bit more information about who the people that were there, what they were feeling and thinking, that might help me make decisions about how I move forward with whatever came out of that meeting. So as the video catches back up to where we were a moment ago, we'll see what that looks like. The final part of the analysis that we captured in this example of how generative AI can be used in this context is just to remind folks that it's not only about bullet points and summaries and things like that, but you can also do other formats. So there's the decision being made, and no one seemed to be upset by the final decision. They acknowledged it was a tough decision. But then we're going to ask, well, what about the pros and cons that people talked about? What were the reasons they wanted to delay the project versus the reasons they thought it was a bad idea to delay the project? And it can bring up just a table. And you'll notice, very similar to what we saw before, that this has a little numbers at the end of each of these, and those are the citations, very similar to the examples we saw before, that can be clicked on and start to gain information about where in the transcript it's getting that information from. So one, you can verify that that seems right to you, and that maybe you want to see more of the conversation. You say, oh, I was actually really interested in, it says that it aligns with the long-term strategy and roadmap for the product, but maybe I'm not familiar with the long-term strategy for the product. So I click on that number 5, go to that point in the transcript, and then I can read the whole conversation around that. So these are examples of how these tools can be used. And the fact that it's in plain language makes them pretty intuitive to start using. And for anyone who's using this sort of suite of tools to do work on a day-to-day basis, it can be pretty powerful. Before I go on, and I'm going to dive into a couple of more examples that I mentioned earlier and give a little bit more detail on them. Are there any questions, Anna?
There are, but I can hold them for the Q&A.
Sounds good. So I want to talk a little bit more about some of the examples that I mentioned at the outset, that when we were talking about impact. So when we talk about the use of translation, this is an example out of India that is one based on a mobile application that can be used from a variety of places, obviously, which is really important in the context of this use case that the customer was trying to do. And also, it is designed to be flexible in terms of the input that you are giving it. And so you can put the question in the language that you speak, and it will analyze that and then give a response in that same language. And it's not dependent on finding that information in the same language on your backend as a government. So suppose I have all my language or all my content about a particular policy or information in English, and someone's asking about this question in another language, it'll be able to do all of that translation, understand, okay, this person's asking me this question in, let's say, Spanish, but I understand that we have the information only in English. I'm going to find that answer, I'm going to translate it, and I'm going to give it back to the person. And it will still provide those, citations to help folks find the source of the information. I will point back to the original language version. A lot of people are using these sorts of translation services to make their websites available in a variety of languages as well. And it does so at a pretty accurate level. So really important, especially in this context where the users that they had in mind were pretty far physically, geographically remote, and needed to have a reliable way of interacting with their government. City of Kelowna, I mentioned earlier, and it's really the key metric that they were really caring about was cutting down on the time it took to get permits approved. That was really the end goal of what they wanted to do with generative AI. I mentioned the chatbot that they created earlier that helps people get into the right application pipeline, how they're using generative AI to cut out some of those situations where the back and forth costs people a lot of time if they're the one trying to get the permit, costs the government a lot of time if they're having to go back and forth individually with folks. So to the extent that they're able to do that, it is something that they're able to do, reduce that time to permit. And Jazz Pablo, who's their director of IT, has a quote here. And I think it's important to mention, right, that this isn't just something that you have to be a huge enterprise to do, whether you're a large state or a small state, a big city or a small city. The city of Kelowna is quite small, actually. It's not got a gigantic IT department. It doesn't have a huge population, but it was able to use the technologies just the same based on its by focusing on the staff that they do have and thinking really carefully about the use case and the metrics that they care most about influencing. And so thinking about that, I think, is really the lesson as we look at what the city of Kelowna has done. They're putting a lot of thought up front into exactly the metrics that they care about influencing with their AI solutions. And by doing that, focusing more on those outcomes. Last one that I'll walk through here. I know we're about 44 minutes in, it looks like. With the adoption of AI, this is the Attorney General looking to make their legal proceedings more efficient. So this speaks to that information assistant example that I gave a little bit earlier. It's a similar sort of use case in that there are lots of documents that have to be read through, that have to be taken into consideration, that a staff might have to review in the advance of a particular proceeding. And that's how they're thinking about using this document now. So it's really about enabling their workforce in the context of their normal everyday workflow to use this tool to help them cut down on the time it takes them to prepare. And so hundreds of pages of documents can become a few pages to review. Key bits in that summary can be gone and looked at using those citations, and it becomes a tool, not a replacement for the person, but a tool for that person to do their job and focus on the areas that they know need the most focus in the context, in this case, of legal proceedings. So when we think about the use of AI in these sorts of contexts, when it comes to something like a legal proceeding, I think they've put a lot of thought into the governance. They've put a lot of thought into how the staff should use it, the training of the staff, and ensuring that the information is accurate, that they are not missing things, that they are not spending time having to backtrack and look through things that may take even more time, right? And so again, focus on the metrics, focus on the use case, focus on the training and the governance models around it to ensure that they're getting the solutions they want. And so all of these things across the examples that I've mentioned and the demos that I show also have quite a bit of time spent in the building and the testing before they ever go live. And that's a particularly important thing as well, so that those tools are doing what they want out there in the world on the day that they're launched. So when we think about how to get started, whether it's with Microsoft or anyone else for that matter, it starts with data. Data is really at the core of a lot of this, and ensuring that your data is well curated, maintained, that your teams are empowered to build the data estate that they need to make these tools work is tremendously important. Thinking about the different ways that governance should be applied, and training your staffs as well, so that folks are ready to use this when the tools come to them. And that's where I want to stop, because I want to make sure that we have time to get into all these questions. I've seen there's quite a few messages in the chat.
Yeah, thank you so much, Doug, for that. That was really insightful and helpful. I'm just going to stop the recording as promised.